So we're going to continue on with solving quadratic equations part 2, and we are going to continue on in examples regarding solving quadratic equations by factoring. Okay, so just a quick reminder, when we're solving by factoring, we want our quadratic equation to be set equal to 0 in the form of ax squared plus bx plus c in that order as well, because that's how we talked about factoring. Okay, so example 1, solve for x. So in this case, it's not set equal to 0, so we can do that. I highly recommend keeping x squared positive. When x squared is negative, it becomes really difficult to factor. Not insurmountable, but just you have to be thinking that that's negative when you're doing it. And so I am going to move the 20x to the other side to keep my x squared positive. So I'm going to subtract 20x from both sides. So I have x squared minus 20x is equal to 0. The first thing we look for when we're factoring is a greatest common factor. So that's what we're going to do here. If we look at x squared and 20x, our greatest common factor is x. Okay, so we're going to take that out, and we're left with x minus 20. Okay, and to prove that to yourself, you can distribute the x to see that you get x squared minus 20. Now, again, look, we have x times x minus 20, and we want that to be equal to 0. So if the first factor is 0 or the second factor is 0, the product of the two will be 0. So here, we just said x is equal to 0, which means x is 0. And then we also say x minus 20 equals 0, so x is 20. So our two answers are 0 and 20. Next, example 2, solve for x. 3x squared equals 5x plus 2. Again, I know that there's only one term on the left side, and you can easily move that to the right and have everything on one side, but I keep my x squared positive. So I'm going to move the 5x and the 2. Okay, and this is going to give me 3x squared minus 5x minus 2 equal to 0. Now this is a case where the number in front of x squared is different than 1. In this case, it's greater than 1. So this is where you would use the AC method, bottoms up, slip and slide, guess and check, or the X method. So I'm going to do the X method here, but at this point, whatever method you use to factor this one is what you would use. Okay. Oops. So I'm going to build my X. And so in the top, we multiply 3 times negative 2 to give negative 6. And in the bottom, we put negative 5. And on the sides, we're looking for two numbers that multiply to negative 6 but add to negative 5. So in this case, we have negative 6 and 1. And then for this method, we take the number that's in front of x squared and divide each of these two numbers by that number. So we take negative 6 and divide by 3, and 1 and divide by 3. And then we reduce. So on the right, 1/3 stays as 1/3. Okay, and on the left, this becomes negative 2 or negative 2 over 1. So each factor then, I'm going to start with this one. 3 is the coefficient of x, and we have positive 1 on top. 1 is the coefficient of x, and we have negative 2. So this factors into 3x plus 1 times x minus 2 is equal to 0. And again, you could always use FOIL on the left-hand side to make sure this is factored correctly. But I'm going to go to the next slide to write this out and solve. So I have 3x plus 1 times x minus 2 equals 0. So we take each of our factors and set them equal to 0. Okay. So we subtract 1 and then divide by 3. And again, we get a fraction, but that's okay. And then we add 2 to both sides. So our two answers are negative 1/3 and 2. Next, solve for x. X squared minus 49 equals 0. So in this case, when you have perfect squares, you want to be a little bit suspicious that it's going to be one of our perfect square factorizations, either the difference of two perfect squares or perfect square trinomials. Since this only has two terms, it's not a trinomial. And so we'll use the difference of two perfect squares, where both of these, x squared is a perfect square and 49 is a perfect square. So this factors into a squared minus b squared, a minus b, a plus b. Okay, so this is x minus 7, x plus 7 is equal to 0. And then we take each factor and set it equal to 0. Okay, so then we'll get x is 7 and negative 7. Example 4, 16x squared minus 25. Again, when you see two perfect squares and their subtraction between the two of them, you want to be thinking of difference of two perfect squares. Okay, so the square root of 16x squared is 4x, and the square root of 25 is 5. Okay, so this 4x plays the role of A, 5 plays the role of B. So this factors into 4x minus 5, 4x plus 5 equals 0. And then what we do is we take each of those and set them equal to 0 to solve for x. So we have 4x minus 5 equals 0, 4x plus 5 equals 0. And then to solve 4x minus 5 equals 0, we start by adding 5 to both sides. So we have 4x equals 5. And then when we divide by 4, we get x is 5/4. For the one on the right-hand side, we have 4x plus 5 is equal to 0, so we subtract 5 from both sides. And we have 4x is equal to negative 5. And again, to solve for x, we're going to divide by 4 to get x is negative 5/4. Okay, so here are our two answers. The last one that we'll do, solve for x, 64x squared plus 48x equals negative 9. When solving by factoring, we want this to be set equal to 0. Okay, so we have 64x squared plus 48x plus 9 equals 0. All I did was I added 9 to both sides. Okay, so you might be thinking AC method, slip and slide bottoms up, or the x method. But when you multiply 64 times 9, how all of those methods start, you're going to get a really big number. Remember, when you see perfect squares, you want to be a bit suspicious. So this is a perfect square trinomial. And so what we're going to do is it's going to factor into the square root of the first term, plus or minus, depending on what the middle term is, the square root of the last term. Okay, and if you want a formula that corresponds with that, when we have ax squared plus bx plus c, let me actually write that differently for the formula. When you have a squared minus 2ab plus b squared, that factors into a minus b squared, or if there's a plus sign here, this would be a plus, okay? So the square root of 64x squared is 8x. So I'm going to start building my factors. The square root of 9 is 3, okay? And then we've got a positive 48. So this tells us that our factors need to add to a positive number. So I'm going to put a plus sign in between, okay? And you can follow the formula as well. Usually with these, I make sure I distribute or use FOIL to make sure I get back to the original. And this is equal to 0. Okay, so I set each factor now equal to 0. And notice they're the same thing. 8x plus 3 equals 0, 8x plus 3 equals 0. So we're going to get the same number from both. So this is a case where you have one answer. It does occur twice to preserve what's happening when you have x squared, but the answers for each are the same. So we subtract 3, divide by 8, so we get x is equal to negative 3/8. Okay, and you only need to write it once. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me.